Welcome to another video. This is JC Diaz. This episode of JC Diaz is brought to you by no one, just me, no sponsors. In today's video, I would like to talk to you guys about the Insurrection Act, the history of the Insurrection Act. Given the events that are happening in the state of Minnesota, in the city of Minneapolis, where people are protesting the ICE agents that have been operating over there. The president has called or has threatened to send the military, to deploy the military to the city of Minneapolis. And he was talking about keeping them on call, about 1,500 of them, in case he will enact the Insurrection Act. And, you know, I figure since this is a topic right now, I will bring you guys a little history of the Insurrection Act. And so I think that will be necessary. So what I'll do is we'll start the show and then I'll play a video clip for you guys. And then I'll do a little reading about the history of the Insurrection Act. So let's go ahead and get the show started, and I'll be back in a few minutes.
Let's set the record straight. The Insurrection Act isn't a loophole. It's the law. It's the safeguard our founders built to preserve the Union when states refuse to protect the rights of their citizens or enforce federal law. Under normal conditions, the military doesn't act as police. That's what the Posse Comitatus Act prevents. But when governors or mayors abandon their duty, when violence, defiance, or political theater make enforcement impossible, the Insurrection Act allows the president to act. Not to conquer the states, but to restore order, protect citizens, and reestablish the rule of law. Here's how it works. There are three legal pathways for invoking it. One, when a state requests help during rebellion or unrest. Two, when federal law can't be enforced by normal means because of obstruction or rebellion. And three, when state leaders refuse to protect constitutional rights or defy federal authority altogether. Before troops move, the president must first issue a public proclamation ordering agitators to disperse, a final warning before action. It's not martial law. Civilian government continues. Military's role is supportive, not supreme. And the president's power is still bound by the Constitution, judicial review, and public accountability. The act has been used by Presidents Jefferson, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Bush Sr., always to uphold the law when local leaders failed to. Today, as some governors and mayors threaten federal officers, ignore immigration law, and even promise to prosecute ICE agents, the stage is set for another showdown. If that moment comes, the Insurrection Act is the legal mechanism that defines where state defiance ends and federal authority begins. My friends, we are all anonymous, and remember, law without enforcement is chaos, and the Insurrection Act exists to prevent exactly that.
Welcome back. Thank you guys for being here with me. So let's talk about the Insurrection Act, right? What is the Insurrection Act? The Insurrection Act authorizes the president to deploy military forces inside the United States to suppress rebellion or domestic violence or to enforce the law in certain situations. The statute implements Congress' authority under the Constitution to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. It is the primary exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, under which federal military forces are generally barred from participating in civilian law enforcement activities. Although it is often referred to as the Insurrection Act of 1807, the law is actually a conjunction of different statutes enacted by Congress between 1792 and 1871. What does invoking the Insurrection Act allow the president and military to do? Under normal circumstances, the Insurrection Act, the Posse Comitatus Act, forbids the U.S. military, including federal armed forces and National Guard troops who have been calling to federal service, from taking part in civilian law enforcement. This prohibition reflects an American tradition that views military interference in civilian government as being inherently dangerous to liberty. Invoking the Insurrection Act temporarily suspends this rule and allows the president to deploy the military to assist civilian authorities with law enforcement. That might involve soldiers doing anything from enforcing a federal court order to suppressing an uprising against the government. Of course, not every domestic use of the military involves law enforcement activities. Other laws, such as the Stafford Act, allows the military to be used to respond to natural disasters, public health crises, and other similar events without waiving the restrictions of the Posse Comitatus Act. In theory, the Insurrection Act should be used only in a crisis that is truly beyond the capacity of civilian authorities to manage. Again, I'm going to explain it in a simple way. The Insurrection Act should only be used in a crisis that is unmanageable by police officers, by local authorities, etc. However, the Insurrection Act fails to adequately define or limit when it might be used, and instead gives the president significant power to decide when and where to deploy U.S. military forces domestically. Meaning, the president has a lot of power. And I don't know if the founding fathers, they were realizing at the time how much power they were giving to only one person. I don't know if, it was different times back then. So I don't know how far into the future they were looking at when they gave one person such a broad power, and giving this one person all this power to decide what needs to be done is something that is questionable. When can the president invoke the Insurrection Act? Troops can be deployed under 3 sections of the Insurrection Act. Each of these sections is designed for a different set of situations. Section 251 allows the president to deploy troops if a state's legislature or governor, if the legislature is unavailable, if a governor requests federal aid to suppress an insurrection in that state. This provision is the oldest part of the law and the one that has most often been invoked. While Section 251 requires state consent, Sections 252 and 253 allow the president to deploy troops without a request from the affected state, even against the state's wishes. Again, like I was saying, the president has a lot of power when it comes to the Insurrection Act. Section 252 permits deployment in order to enforce the laws of the United States or to suppress rebellion against the U.S. government whenever unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion make it impracticable to enforce federal law in the state by the ordinary course of judicial proceedings. Section 253 has 2 parts. The first allows the president to use the military in a state that to suppress any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy that so hinders the execution of the laws, that any portion of the state's inhabitants are deprived of a constitutional right and state's authorities are unable to or unwilling to protect that right. Presidents Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy relied on this provision to deploy troops to desegregate schools in the South after the Supreme Court's landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education. The second part of the Section 253 permits the president to deploy troops to suppress any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy in a state that opposes or obstructs the execution of the laws of the United States or impedes the course of justice under those laws. What are the limitations on deployment under the Insurrection Act? Although the Insurrection Act appears to confer wide-ranging authority, the Department of Justice has long taken the position that the law is limited by the Constitution and by tradition. In a 1964 memorandum, the Deputy Attorney General wrote that the law may be invoked in 3 circumstances: when a state requests help in putting down an insurrection, when deployment is needed to enforce a federal court order, or when state and local law enforcement have completely broken down. Moreover, even on its face, the Insurrection Act only permits the use of troops to enforce either federal laws or a narrow category of state laws, essentially civil rights protection. So the Insurrection Act should be used to deploy the military to protect the citizens of that state. Troops could not be used, for instance, to combat street crime, as that type of criminal activity is governed by state and local laws. Most important, no statute can override the Constitution. Accordingly, troops deployed under the Insurrection Act may not violate individuals' constitutional rights. They might not, for example, search a person's home without a warrant. And while the Insurrection Act is an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, it is not an exception to the federal laws that might apply to their conduct. For instance, the law criminalizes the presence of federal troops at polling places. How has the Insurrection Act been used in the past? The Insurrection Act has been invoked about 30 times throughout American history. Presidents George Washington and John Adams used it in response to early rebellions in the states against federal authority. President Abraham Lincoln invoked it at the start of the Civil War, and President Ulysses Grant used it to crush the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s. Several other presidents, including Andrew Jackson, Rutherford B. Hayes, and Grover Cleveland, have deployed troops under the Insurrection Act to intervene in labor disputes, almost always on the side of employers. Most famously, Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Lyndon B. Johnson all invoked the Insurrection Act during the Civil Rights Movement to enforce federal court orders desegregating schools and other institutions in the South. In the latter half of the 20th century, Presidents Johnson and George W. Bush each invoked the law in response to massive civil unrest that caused dozens of fatalities. These 20th century incidents reflect a modern consensus that the Insurrection Act is an exceedingly specialized precedent tool. Indeed, in the past 130 years, it has been used exclusively in 2 circumstances: either when state and local law enforcement were overwhelmed and governors asked for the federal military assistance, or when states' authority were themselves actively obstructing federal civil rights laws or failing to protect constitutional rights. So basically, the Insurrection Act should only be used to protect against an insurrection. Somebody is trying to overthrow the government, or to protect the civil rights of civilians. When was the Insurrection Act last invoked? The Insurrection Act was last invoked in 1992 when the governor of California requested military aid from President George W. Bush in response to the civil unrest in Los Angeles that followed the acquittal of 4 white police officers charged with beating black motorist Rodney King. The violence in Los Angeles killed 63 people and resulted in $1 billion worth of property damage. At 33 years and counting, this is the longest period the United States has ever gone without an invocation of the Insurrection Act. No president has invoked the Insurrection Act without a request from the state concerned since Johnson did so to provide protection for civil rights activists in Alabama, marching from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. So that was the history of the Insurrection Act. And my take on this matter is the president has threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act if the protests in Minneapolis don't, if they continue or if they get out of control. So far from what I've seen, most of the out of control issues have been caused by the ICE agents. So what that means is, should the president invoke the Insurrection Act, I am hoping that he will make the right decision and that he will invoke the Insurrection Act to protect the civilians, to protect their constitutional rights. People who are protesting peacefully, people who are not attacking anybody, their rights should be protected. I'm hoping the president does or makes the right decision if he decides to invoke the Insurrection Act. And he will protect the civilians who are protesting peacefully in the city of Minneapolis. I know that, this is a really old law, and I don't know, man. I just feel like it's a lot of power for one person. It's definitely a lot of power for one person. But I'm just hoping the president makes the right decision, and instead of provoking, instead of making it more difficult, he uses the Insurrection Act. Should he do it? Should he invoke it? He should use it to protect the civilians, not to go against the civilians or agitate the civilians, which will make it worse. There are rumors out there, allegedly, there are rumors that his plan is to provoke as much as he can so he can enact the martial law. Now, this is only rumors, allegedly. It hasn't been proved. It hasn't been, proved that it's true. So I'm just saying that the rumors are out there. And if the rumors are out there, it's because some people believe it. So let's hope that should the president invoke the Insurrection Act, that he should do it in a manner that will protect the civil rights of the individuals who are protesting ICE agents. So this is JC Diaz. I hope you guys have a great day, and I hope you learned something from this video. I'll see you guys on the next video. See you later. Peace.